front of you we have the Prime Minister of Estonia, Taavi Rõivase, and Jose Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD. First, I would like to give the floor to Prime Minister Taavi Rõivase.
Aitäh! Meil on olnud suur au juba mõned aastad olla maailma, võib öelda, et kõige edukamate riikide klubi OECD täieõiguslik liige.
We have had the honor and pleasure of being for quite some years now the member of OECD club of the most successful countries in the world.
Ja nii nagu me täna peasekretär Gurriaga ka arutasime, siis Eesti hindab väga kõrgelt neid soovitusi, neid kõrvalpilke, mis meie antud juhul siis majandusele OECD poolt antakse.
And as we discussed today with the Secretary General Gurria, Estonia really evaluates very highly these suggestions that this honorable organization is giving us.
Ja kuigi konkreetsetest soovitustest me räägime hiljem, siis ütleme nii, et mulle väga meeldiks, kui kõik Eesti poliitikud, kõik need inimesed, kes parlamenti pürgivad, loeksid kas või vähemasti kokkuvõtte sellest raportist läbi, sest see annab väga selgeid ideid ka selleks, kus on meie poliitikate kitsaskohad.
We are going to speak about the specific proposals later, but I would like very much if all Estonian politicians, and especially those that are aspiring to become members of the parliament now, would read through a summary of this document, because there are quite clear ideas about what our bottlenecks are.
Ja nii nagu peasekretär Gurria on öelnud, et OECD on nagu jõusaal, kus OECD poolt pakutakse siis vahendid või treeningmasinad ja igal ühel on vaba valik ise valida, milliseid lihasgruppe ta parajasti treenib, siis Eesti ambitsioon peaks olema võimalikult terviklik treenitus, ambitsiooni kõrgel hoidmine ja see, et OECD on oma hinnangutes öelnud, et Eestil on minevikus läinud väga hästi ja me oleme teinud õigeid asju, ei peaks mingil juhul tähendama seda, et me ambitsiooni kuidagi madalamale laseks. Vastupidi, me peame positiivseid trendi jätkama.
The Secretary General has described the OECD as if it were a gym where there are many different machines that you can exercise your different muscles, but it is up to you to pick which ones to exercise and what to train. Estonia's ambition is to train the whole body, if we can say that, and keep the ambitions high. And even if Estonia has done well in the past, that does not mean that we shouldn't be striving to do well also in the future. Thank you, and now the floor goes to Mr. Gurria.
Well, thank you. Are we going to be translating into Estonian? No? Okay, then. Thank you very much. Prime Minister, I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for the privilege of receiving us, and thank you for the hospitality that you and your cabinet and your members and the central bank and Ambassador Koch have provided us today. Estonia was, of course, one of the hardest hit countries by the crisis, and I have to say that through the education I have received from my team, from all Mr. Andreas, the three experts who are all called Andreas, they have taught me over the years how important the effort that you all have made, because the first time I delivered a report here was in 2009, 2011, 2013, you know. It was dramatic. The moment was very dramatic. It was very difficult. You all know about it, but I think we always have to remember where we are coming from. Now, the question is, you are now going to grow perhaps 2.5% or thereabouts this year, maybe 3.5% next year, positive growth, a multiple of what your neighbors in the euro area are growing, and even of the OECD. So you are perhaps next year going to be above the pre-crisis in terms of the level of the GDP per capita. But it also shows you that it's been a long struggle. Huh? You're now getting back to higher than pre-crisis level, but it takes a few years. So now, unemployment, 17% at the peak in 2010, now 7.5% today, another sign of progress. It has not just been these indicators. Product and labor market regulations have helped, and the public administration is effective. The fiscal position is very strong. What can I say? I mean, corporate taxation is low, but it's also simple, not too complicated. Banking system is financially sound. Education outcomes are good. So together, these underlying strengths have helped a vibrant, innovative startup firms to emerge, notably in the ICT services sector. So I would say that this is the framework today. It's a good story. It's a story of hardship a few years ago and of success in the recovery, and also of having looked at the balances in the different areas. It has not just been a recovery in one sector, but basically taking a look at the different policies. Now, but here comes the challenge. Estonia is still a catch-up country. That means there is some distance before it closes the gap between itself and the top-performing OECD countries. Skills mismatches, declining labor supply because of aging, and in some cases because of migration, pose risks to its competitiveness. There has been what I would call asymmetric benefit from this recovery, this growth. The poorest households have not seen the same type of benefit. In fact, Estonia is more unequal than the average of the OECD. And the gender gap, that means the difference in participation in the labor market of women and the men, is large. That's challenging. Also, for an aging society and for a labor force that is more or less stable, it's very important to get, like they say in the boats, in the ships, you know, all hands on deck. Everybody should be participating. And clearly here, this is an unutilized or underutilized economic asset, which is the work of women. Now, also the economy is among the most greenhouse gas intensive in the OECD because of the dependence on shale. And therefore the question is, yes, how does one continue on this trajectory of recovered growth, but at the same time to make for a society that is more inclusive and for an environment which is more sustainable? So strong, robust, but also inclusive, sustainable growth. Of course, this has to be the target. And this is why our recommendations here. In a way, I was telling the Prime Minister, it's a more complex set of recommendations. Because when the economy sunk in 2009, like all the economies in the world practically, the question was to get out of the hole. You know, it was really the only concern. The question now, after a successful recovery, is more complex because it's in the labor market, it's in the education, it's in the innovation. It has to do with the taxes, it has to do with the pension funds, it has to do with the gender issues, it has to do with foreign investment, it has to do with all sorts of areas. And this is why the recommendations are more, if you will, diverse, because now the next steps to go to the next level is more challenging, and at the same time it takes a lot of coordination of the different policies. Now, the economic survey says 2 ways to go. One, raise productivity growth, and the second, make the most of your rich human capital endowment. Already Estonia has a rich human capital endowment, how to leverage the most in a context in which you are increasing productivity. The report has those 2 special chapters, one about productivity and the other one about human capital. So productivity has to be the main driver of GDP growth, but in catch-up countries, productivity, I would say, is absolutely indispensable as a driver of convergence, and you have to combine it with the human side, the human capital. So now, despite the fact that the private sector is doing well and is thriving, GDP per hour worked in Estonia is less than half the average of the top half of the OECD. So we naturally aspire for Estonia to be there together with the best in terms of productivity. But today, we are halfway there in terms of how much a worker, average worker, produces for every hour work, for every day work, for every week work. Okay. And the gap is closing relatively slow. That's a big challenge. Now, to accelerate convergence in living standards, productivity clearly needs kind of a shot in the arm, you know, it gets to. Some areas where we are proposing. First, knowledge transfer. The question of how does one import knowledge, technology, and adapt it and adopt it here. Second, the infrastructure gaps that exist. Many have been addressed. You have been using some of the cohesion funds and improving on your infrastructure, but some remains. Good energy and transport connectivity still remains with the rest of the EU. Plans to connect to the European high-speed railway network, of course, show a lot of promise, a lot of potential. And the upgrading of the rural road network within the country itself also is important. So it's with the outside, but also within. And energy efficiency is crucial because here you need productivity, but also you need some kind of green growth. Emissions could be reduced well, practically by 2/3 simply by processing oil shale into lighter oil products. One can also improve a lot the energy efficiency of the buildings. This is part of the recommendations. Now, so this is about the productivity, but what about the human capital? The PISA, you know PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. This is a brand of the OECD.
We know as we were ranking high, so we know.
Yeah. Oh, I knew you were going to like it very much, because you do very well. You are above the average on reading and arithmetic and on science, and you do quite well. Sometimes almost equivalent to 1 year above the averages. So you do very well. You're among the best. Adult literacy and numeracy skills above average. You have reduced the share of the young people who drop out to about 10%, which is very, very much lower than before. But the question is, still too few of the young people leave school with a degree that is relevant to the skills that they need for the job market. So there is a mismatch there. The experience of other countries show that education and training provided at the workplace, not just at school, is a very effective way for the young people to acquire the skills that employers need. Improvements have been impressive when you talk about Estonian vocational education, but not sufficiently workplace-based. That means it is not yet matching very well what the market is saying. What do we need? What does the private sector need? What kind of skills and this is a very drastic and dramatic paradox. You have people unemployed, and at the same time companies saying, I cannot find the talent. Because the young people who are unemployed have diplomas or came out of the schools or vacation, but do not have the skills that the markets are demanding. Now, students also with some disadvantaged backgrounds, that means from socioeconomic background or more vulnerable families, also need stronger support, because their support to attend the vocational schools to so-called level the playing field. This is a social issue. Estonia clearly has excellent human capital to build on. One major challenge, however, is the way the tax system is structured, because it makes it harder to reap the benefits. The question is, still today, the taxes attached to creating one more additional job are high. The tax burden on labor, both for the worker but also for the employer, remains high. And here, when I'm talking about tax, I mean taxes, but also the contributions to social security, etc. The total cost of creating one more job and keeping one more job is relatively high in Estonia if you compare it to other countries. So this will help create jobs, fight poverty. It's also, there's a question of the economic potential of women. I mentioned that about the gender gap. But also the question of the child care facilities. This has proven to be one of the most productive, one of the most useful investments. More child care liberates women to work, but also women who work are now documented, absolutely objectively measured, have higher fertility, larger families in societies which in Europe in particular, or sometimes in countries like Japan, like Korea, tend to be basic stationed, flat growth or no growth. And we have a combination of stimulus because the women feel better about the future, and then they feel more comfortable with having larger families or more children, or this is kind of a win-win proposition. It's also a question of allowing for the pay gap. It's not just a job gap, that means participation, But also imagine that a woman and a man with the same studies, same competences, same jobs, then there's a big pay gap. That's another area of the gaps that has to be addressed. There's also a question of let's say, how fair the society is perceived to be, and therefore how satisfied people may be of belonging to this type of society. The question is, how does one make for a fairer type of society, reducing unemployment, improving the incomes of the lower paid workers, maybe alleviating a little bit of the tax burden of the lower paid, helping young people and women in the workforce, and again I say reducing the gender gap. Now, reform, of course, is not easy, and it never comes cheap. This means more resources may be necessary to address some policy priorities. But I have to say, maybe you don't realize it here in Estonia, but I think it's perhaps at this stage fair to say that you are the only OECD economy, and probably one of the few in the world, that can say that they have no government debt. In fact, somebody was asking about this. How about the market in government debt? They say there's no market in government debt because there's no government debt. You know, they said that's a very nice problem to have. Huh? There's no government debt. No, clearly, and here I want to say this because the biggest problem today is weak public finances, too much debt on the books. And remember, inflation is practically flat, which is very heavy. If you have debt, to move through a process of low inflation is like walking in the water. You know, it's very difficult to move in the water. You make very slow progress. Estonia has the enormous benefit, hard earned. You know, you earned it. You were prudent. You were responsible in terms of managing your public finances. And now you have a situation where all over the world we're seeing the consequences of not being prudent or not being responsible, where you have looking, you know, much better, probably a sensation of being free, you know, of being able to fly. I am a Mexican. I come from a country which had its own debt problems. I was Minister of Finance. I therefore know very well what happens when you abuse the debt or when you are not responsible or prudent enough. You get into all sorts of trouble. So for me, it is particularly satisfactory to say to you congratulations. But that also produces an additional benefit, which is you have room. Then the room has to be used sparingly, judiciously, with the same prudence, with the same sense of responsibility, whenever it would be necessary for long-term purposes, for things that will be transformational, but the knowledge that you have the room should also allow you to sleep better at night. Right? So let me finally, Prime Minister, simply say, again, this is a story of hardship in the earlier years of the crisis, of recovery, and now of very positive behavior and very positive evolution of the Estonian economy and of Estonian society. And at the same time, what we're talking about now is how do we move to the next level? how does one move this country into closer to the large averages of Europe, of the OECD, etc. And please count on the OECD for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Aitäh härra Gurriale ja nüüd ma annaksin taas sõna härra Rõivasele
I
kommentaariks.
have for the photo, I have to deliver to him the report, you know. Is it like this? Like this?
And now I would like to say a few, I'll give the floor back to the Prime Minister.
Ma väga tänan peasekretär Gurriat kõigepealt selle väga konstruktiivse raporti ja teiseks loomulikult väga positiivsete sõnade eest.
I would very much like to thank Secretary General Gurria for this constructive report and positive words.
See annab meile kindluse, et me oleme teinud palju asju õigesti ja me peame oskama ka õiget kurssi jätkata.
This gives us insurance that we have done many things correctly and that also allows us to carry on along the same path.
Ja selleks, et mitte liigselt lasta kiitusele end uinutada, ma keskenduksingi nendele väljakutsetele, nii nagu peasekretär Gurria ütles, et mida teha selleks, et jõuda järgmisele tasemele, et jõuda kõrgema elatustasemeni, see, mis on meie suur ja oluline eesmärk.
And in order not to allow us to slumber in the words of praise, I would like to discuss briefly how we could reach the next level, as Mr. Gurria has just said.
Siin selles raportis on olemas võrdlus erinevate valdkondadega Eesti ja OECD keskmine ja me näeme, et meie kõige suuremad vajakud on teemades, kus me tegelikult teame, kus meil on veel tee minna, see on sissetulekud ja inimeste tervis.
In this survey, there are comparisons of different sectors of how Estonia has done as opposed to the average OECD countries. And the main challenges have been brought out, and we really do know what these challenges are ourselves as well. They have to do with income and people's health. Ja just nii nagu see inglise keeles kõlab people's health, siis tervise puhul ongi kõige suurem väljakutse just nimelt rahva tervis, et meil on väga heal ja kvaliteetsel tasemel meditsiin, aga me teame, et me Eestis ikkagi elame keskmiselt märksa vähem kui OECD-s ja see tähendab, et rahva tervisega, sealhulgas suuremate riskikäitumistega tuleb intensiivselt tegeleda. People's health, or rather we have to deal with public health, because in Estonia we do have excellent medical services, but there's also risk behaviors that need to be tackled in order to raise their life expectancy and bring it closer to the other OECD countries' levels.
Ja see kõik on seotud ka tootlikkusega ja seetõttu mul on hea meel, et OECD on järjepidevalt toetanud ka Eesti valitsuse reforme, mis seda teemat adresseerivad, sealhulgas inimeste töövõimet parandavat töövõimereformi.
And all this also comes down to productivity, and therefore I am glad that the OECD has always been supporting Estonia and Estonia's government reforms to this effect, and that also includes the capacity for work reform.
Ja tootlikkusega on üheselt seotud ka sissetulekud.
And productivity is closely related to incomes as well.
Sest kui me suudame tootlikkust tõsta, siis ainult nii on meil võimalik maksta kestlikult kõrgevaid palkasid ja kui meil on kõrgevad palgad, siis see toob ka kõrgevad pensionid ja sotsiaaltoetused nendele, kes seda tuge vajavad.
Productivity is closely related to incomes, as I said, and only so we can pay sustainably higher salaries, which leads to sustainably higher pensions and also higher social benefits for those who need that.
Ja siin on nüüd meil väljakutsed üksjagu keerulised, sest nagu peasekretär Gurria ütles, me peame jõudma järgmisele tasemele, meil on selge samm vaja ette võtta.
And here the challenges are somewhat more complicated and more complex. and as the Secretary General said, we have to take a new step to reach the next level.
Ja mul on hea meel, et OECD eksperdid, kellest keegi ei kandideeri Eesti Vabariigis eelseisvatel parlamendivalimistel, on jõudnud ka selle selge veendumiseni, ja neil on tegelikult see olnud juba aastaid, et Eestis tuleks tööjõumaksusid langetada, eeskätt on küsimus sotsiaalmaksus ja ka tulumaksuvabas miinimumis, mis on liiga madal.
And I am glad that the OECD experts have come to the same conclusion that we have already for some years, and I'm also glad that they are not running for the parliament in Estonia, because we've always known that we need to reduce the labor taxes, especially the social contributions, and we have to increase the basic exemption, which is far too low.
So this is not just a question of government or political program, but this is something that experts say that are definitely independent in this respect. Aga lõpetuseks ma ütleks seda, et hästi oluline on ka jälgida kõikides nendes soovitustes, et meie majanduskasvu eeldused püsiksid nii heal kohal, kui nad praegu on. Et Eesti õpilaste haridustase, tulemused PISA testides, mis on suur tulevase majanduskasvu allikas, et see ka tulevikus püsiks ja et me sellega peame jätkuvalt edasi tegelema.
And finally, it is important to be able to follow these preconditions for sustained growth. Education, the PISA results, which are very important, these are all very important engines for further growth.
Ja lõpetuseks ka meie majanduskeskkond või ettevõtluskeskkond, et selleks, et siia loodaks töökohti, me arutasime täna pikalt, et rahvusvaheliselt on väga suur konkurents töökohtade loomisele ja selleks peab Eesti jätkuvalt hoidma oma majanduskeskkonna nii atraktiivse nagu vähegi võimalik. Selles kontekstis on mul muidugi hea meel, et uudised Heritage Foundationilt teiselt poolt ookeani olid täna väga positiivsed ja Eesti majandusvabadus on hinnatud maailmas tervelt 8. kohaga ja OECD riikide seas 6. kohaga.
So it is also very important to keep the business environment vibrant. We need to keep creating jobs, and as we were discussing today at length, that creating jobs is a very internationally competitive business as well, and therefore in this context I'm very happy about the news that came from the Heritage Foundation today about the economic freedom of countries, and Estonia came 8th globally and 6th among the OECD countries.
Nii et kokkuvõtvalt me peame võtma neid soovitusi väga tõsiselt ja selleks, et edu saaks jätkuda, peame me pidevalt otsima võimalusi, kuidas veel parem olla.
So we have to take these recommendations very seriously, and in order for us to carry on successfully, we really have to work hard.
Well, also number 1 in the euro area, no?
Yes, number 1 in the EU and number 2 in Europe, just after Switzerland.
Just after Switzerland, so pretty good. Anyway.
But we have to, of course, work hard to keep that place. That doesn't come from...
Aitäh, peaminister Taavi Rõivase ja OECD peasekretär härra Gurria nüüd valmis vastama teie täpsustavatele küsimustele. Te võite esitada küsimusi nii inglise kui eesti keeles, arvestades, et tõlge on ainult eesti keelest inglise keelde ja palun ärge unustage, kellele küsimus on suunatud. Ma annan teile mikrofoni, kes tahab küsida.
Good evening, Margarita Mesnikova, Estonian Television, but I will present my question in Estonian, if you don't mind. In the OECD raportis on palju kirjutatud sellest, et meil on päris tõsine probleem töötusega seotud ning ka sellest, et Eestis on palju inimesi kolinud, ära kolinud. Miks teie arust see probleem on tekitanud ja mis on selle põhjus, ühesõnaga, mida me oleme valesti teinud ja kas on võrreldes teiste OECD riikidega, kui tõsine see probleem meil on? Aitäh. Ja küsimus mõlemale.
I would like to ask both of you the same question. we have a big problem in Estonia about unemployment rather, and many people have migrated. Why is this a problem? Why has this problem emerged? What have we done wrong? And how does this problem compare with other OECD countries?
Very briefly, there is a certain peculiarity in your migration, and that is that mostly it is low-skilled migration. That means these are people who have a lot of flexibility. For example, they can just go to another country, a neighboring country, in Finland, whatever, maybe find a job. The people who are professionals or who have higher skills tend to stay. And they tend to be much less mobile in the sense that they tend to stick around, and they have accompanied this upward recovery. This crisis has been a crisis of young, male, low-skilled. Mostly, everybody has been affected, but if you concentrate, if you want to determine who are the ones that have been most affected, it has been young people, male, low-skilled, mostly. And this pattern repeats in different parts, and it is not very common. In fact, it's an exception that you have the mobility that you have in Europe. Mostly people are constrained by either factors that having to do with housing or economic or political, or simply they cannot go to the next country because they're not allowed. Here, there is that flexibility. How does one avoid that? Is this necessarily bad? No, it's not necessarily bad. The question is, how does one keep the talent and do not have what you would call a brain drain? Because as I said, you are basically, the people who move, there are exceptions, but mostly there are people with lesser qualifications. So here the answer is skills, skills, skills. And not only because this will allow you to keep, because if you're higher qualified, you have a greater chance of finding opportunities here, but also because of what the Prime Minister mentioned. Skills increase productivity. Productivity allows you to increase wages. Greater wages allowed you, as an economy, to have more spending power. More spending power increases total demand. That becomes or translates into higher growth. And then you get into a kind of a virtuous cycle. So I would say, now how does one translate the question of skills into practice? Well, this requires close cooperation between the private sector, the productive sector, the unions, the workers, and the government in order to be able to focus on both what do you teach the students, how relevant is that to the demands of the markets, and then how much do you train the students, and how much do you train the workers once they are in the job? Because it's a lifelong learning. You never stop the process. I would say the answer is skills, skills, and then the third one, would you guess? Skills. Good.
Väga lühidalt täiendaks, ma olen täiesti nõus sellega. Küsimus ei ole ju mitte sellest niivõrd, et Eestis tööpuudus on kõrge, tööpuudus on väga kiiresti langenud, palju kiiremini kui OECD-s tervikuna, aga meil on probleemid konkreetsetes nii-öelda riskirühmades, vähenenud töövõimega inimesed, kelle seas on palju inimesi, kes sooviks tööle saada, aga on objektiivsed takistused, sellega tuleb tegeleda, oskused juba väga põhjalikult sai selgitatud ja ma olen sellega täiesti nõus, et töö vastaksid paremini tööturu nõuetele. Ja kolmandaks ma tooks eraldi välja, et eraldi tähelepanu peab pöörama ka sellele, et kuigi tööpuudus tervikuna on Eestis kogu Euroopa kontekstis üks madalamaid ja järjest ka vähenenud, siis noorte tööpuudus nii nagu Euroopas, nii ka meil on jätkuvalt kõrgem kui üldine. Ja see, et noored saaksid oma esimesed töökohad, see on ka üks selge väljakutse.
I do agree what you said about skills, and it is not that we have very high unemployment rate. On the contrary, it has been reducing rapidly since the crisis, but there are certain risk groups that we have. For example, people with reduced capacity for work, people who would like to work, would like to have jobs, but for objective reasons cannot. And clearly, as you said, there is a skills mismatch as well. And then there is also a third aspect that I'd like to point out. Even if the general unemployment is among the lowest in Europe and is going down, the youth unemployment, as elsewhere in Europe, is going up.
Not going up, but it's higher.
It's high.
It's high, yeah.
Yeah.
Not decreasing enough.
On average, youth unemployment is double the level of average unemployment. On average. But there are some countries in Southern Europe where the proportion is higher. But in general, youth unemployment tends to be about double the average.
That's in our case also.
Which of course we have to address. It's a big challenge.
Kas on veel küsimusi?
Thank you. Mart Liinart, Estonian Public Broadcasting, and question to Mr. Gurria. The recommendations of OECD says that in long term Estonia should consider allowing a small deficit in the government budget rule. In other words, you recommend to make some debts. Where should Estonia put the money, what it gets from the loans?
I am happy that you made the question, because I had a private bet with the Prime Minister that was a question that was going to come up. Because it is the last part of the page, at the bottom, in the longer round. And first of all, let me tell you, I made a very long and eloquent statement about the benefits of having low debt or no debt. Okay. Second, I also said this creates room. This gives you room. Room is used for rainy days, for difficult moments, but also for special impact projects, long-term projects, big infrastructure issues, etc., which cannot be otherwise financed, where the private sector may not be a good, appropriate candidate to come, etc. Now, please remember that this debt ratio is debt to GDP, proportion. How much is the debt vis-a-vis the size of the economy? This means debt can grow. But if the economy grows faster, then the ratio will be reduced. That means debt will be smaller and smaller share of the total size of the economy. So this is the first thing. Second, we say over the long term. Now, what are the sectors? I think today I will say we are not in a position where I would say which one of the many connecting projects that you are going to have, let's say on energy or on electricity or on the connections with Europe on the trains or on the grid. Europe does not have a single integrated electricity market today. Europe does not have a single integrated energy market today. Europe does not have a single integrated telecom market today. There may be a moment, maybe even part of these 315 billion, new investments, whatever, where there is a greater coordinated effort to make the whole economy more competitive, more efficient, and where an effort is asked from Estonia. Now, I'm sure also that if that is the case, there will be some flexibility in terms of the way for which this is accounted. Already, for example, if you contribute to the fund of 315 billion, they're saying we will not count this against the deficit. But you still have to fund it. You still have to go for the resources. And here the question is, number one, keep the very low or decreasing debt to GDP ratio. And number two, I would say, there are certain investments which have a high rate of return financially and certain investments which have a high rate of return socially, and then some which have both. And they're always competing. What do? Do you do more education? Do you do more infrastructure? Do you do more health? All of them are so good, all of them so important. So the fact that you have a fiscal rule that basically says keep your debt steady or keep your deficits flat is a very big message. People understand that very easily. You know, they say, Estonia has a rule. It says no deficit. This is why, if one day you decide that perhaps you could make an exception for an exceptional circumstance, you would still have the credibility. Because people know that in the good times and in the hard times, you had the discipline and you kept it and you stayed. And then if it is needed, that you can go and move away from this. I have 2 or 3 examples, very recent. My own country, a long time ago, has become very, very disciplined in Mexico. But then when the crisis came, they said, okay, we'll do a little bit more. And now they're back. Sweden had large youth unemployment. And then they had a special program to help with the youth. So they had added a little bit more spending on the side, and that came back, and now they are on the adjustment again. So it's a question of using, as I said, using the room that has been created. It's not that with this will allow you to be constantly spending beyond your means or anything like that. This is not an invitation to abandon the discipline. It is, again, to use it, as I said, over the medium and long run. If you have exceptional opportunities or exceptional needs, to be able to fund them, and without causing any doubt about the commitment to the basic discipline.
Kui ma väga põgusalt saan siia täiendada, et ma arvan ka, et see on väga oluline, et ka me Eestis ei mõistaks seda soovitust sellisele, et OECD kutsub üles rohkem jookseid kulutusi tegema, aga mis teoreetiliselt, mis tüüpi projektide puhul võiks laenuga finantseerimine kõne alla tulla, mis tõesti siis sellist strateegilist mõju avaldavad, siis OECD hinnang on see, et kui näiteks Eesti peaks ehitama Rail Balticu ja oma osaluse kataks laenu arvelt, et siis see Eesti rahanduslikku usaldusväärsust ei mõjuta või ei halvenda. Ja ma usun, et see on tõesti nii, aga loomulikult me oleme selles mõttes ka täiesti ühte meelt, et kui Eesti lihtsalt jooksvate kulutuste suurendamiseks või riigiaparaadi paisutamiseks otsustaks eelarve defitsiiti lasta, siis ei läheks väga pikalt aega ka selleks, kui Eesti rahanduslik julgeolek või rahanduslik usaldusväärsus küsimärgi alla seataks.
Let me just add very briefly here. I do agree this is very important for us here in Estonia not to consider the recommendation by OECD as a call for using debt for funding current expenditures. We'd rather have to think of what type of projects could be funded by such a loan. Those projects should have strategic impact. And for example, if Estonia were to finance their own financing part of the Rail Baltic project with a loan, then that would not be detrimental to Estonia's reliability as a fiscally prudent country. But I do agree, no funding of current expenses on account of debt.
Yeah.
veel küsimusi?
Lise Kangsep from the Wall Street Journal. I have a question about productivity, what came up in the report as well. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody who knows something about the Estonian economy that productivity or the lack of growth in productivity has been a problem for us for a long time. So
Yeah.
do you have any kind of specific recommendations how we can change this trend? I mean, there was mentioning of education, but are there anything more specific that you could say about this? Thank you.
Yes, education, innovation, regulation, competition. Not all the words end with shun, but most of them do. Flexibility in the labor markets, flexibility in the product markets, the tax structure, which would tend to de-tax investment and labor and tax more consumption, property tax and green taxes, meaning emissions. Then R&D efforts. And not just how much you spend in R&D, but also who spends in R&D. The more productive packages are 2/3 private sector, 1/3 public sector, normally. The more interesting mix. If the public sector is doing most of the lifting, then normally this is not, it means it's not so connected with the private sector. And then there's a division of labor in research. Basic research normally is done by public sources, and then more applied research is done by commercial sources. And if the two get together, then you go to market. Sometimes you can even recover the investments in the research if it's successful. But remember, to have one successful experiment that goes to market with commercial, you need to try several. So there needs to be a good combination. Then, for example, how do you deal with the question of decentralization or centralization? How do you deal with territorial development, with the differences in development and the differences in income? I was, we've been following more and more, not only countries, but the different regions in the countries. And you find differences in, for example, income inequality that are more blatant than and more exaggerated than among countries themselves, even within the same country. How do you deal with so-called PPPs, the public and private projects? How does one organize the risk factors of that? Who takes the risk in terms of which projects? Is it through first losses? Is it through guarantees? Is it through feed-in tariffs? How do you organize this part? So I would say, how do you deal with the health system? It is the single most important, most expensive line item in many budgets, and growing faster than any other because of aging and because of technology, etc. How do you deal with that? Because otherwise, the speed at which it is growing in many economies is causing big holes in the budgets. So, you see, these things, madam, have one thing in common. As different from monetary policy, interest rates at zero, we are been there, done that. Huh? Then fiscal, spend your way out of the hole. Well, Estonia is one of the few countries that could, but they're choosing not to because they're fiscally responsible. So what do you have left? In many of the other countries, what you are reducing the deficit because you want to bring down the accumulated debt because the debt is too high. Average in the OECD is close to 100% debt to GDP. When people see the 10% of Estonia, they think there's a mistake, there's a typo. They say this needs another zero. He said, no, it's 10%, it's okay. You know? But then the problem is, what do you have left? Well, all these things I have said, education, innovation, competition, regulation, better regulations, less regulations, smarter regulations, well, whatever, you know, better, smarter, it adds up to making the life of business easier, okay? If you look at all these things together, and they all have to be together, by the way, you only 1 is equal to 1. 1 plus 1 is equal to 5. And 1 plus 1 plus 1 is equal to 25. So the structural measures are geometric in their impact. They reinforce each other. So basically, you go structural. You go structural as the response. This is the way you increase productivity. And this is what is here, put in there. You take a look at your energy sources, you take a look at your energy costs, you take a look at how much energy you consume per every unit of GDP that you produce. And basically, you do all of the above. That is what is so more difficult now. This new stage is less obvious, as I said, is more complex, because you have to be, this is like, you know, in the gym, in the Olympic gyms, the gymnasts, they have some, what they call compulsory exercises. They have to go to one corner of the mattress and the other, all over the place, you know, they have to do something mandatory. Then the next day, you go into improvisation. No? But that day is hard work. Everybody has to do the same exercises again and again and again. Well, this is the case. Right now, you have to look at every one of the single areas of productivity in order to be able to be more competitive. So, this is a long answer. I'm sorry for the long answer. It's not simple, but yours was a complex question. Huh?
Kahjuks hakkab meie aeg otsa saama. Ma võtaksin veel ühe küsimuse, kui kellelgi on. David.
David Modesty from Reuters. One quick question. Before at Davos, before the ECB gave its announcement regarding quantitative easing, you said that it should be unlimited both in amount and also in time frame. We've since had the announcement and we also have the limits. Just wondering what your opinion is.
Well, remember that the days before the announcement, it was said that it was going to be 500 billion and it was going to last for 1 year, etc. And I said, well, why don't we do it, you know, open-ended? And then when they came out, they surprised us all. It was a good surprise. It was not 50 billion, it was 60 billion per month, and it was not for 1 year, it was until September, so total about 1 trillion. I think that was good news. We're all pleasantly surprised. We're happy that that has already happened. And now, let's go back to your question, Madam. Let's remember, Mr. Draghi, like Mr. Bernanke and Madame Yellen, and like Mr. Mervyn King, and now Mr. Mark Carney of the Bank of England, and the first Japanese arrow, Mr. Kuroda, in the central bank, they can only do so much. They can keep interest rates low, and they can try to make sure that the yield curve is relatively flat. That means short-term rates low, but also medium and long-term rates low to stimulate investment. But who can do education, innovation, competition, regulation? Who can do the taxes? Who can do the R&D? Who can do the PPPs? Only governments. So, all I am saying, sir, from Reuters is congratulations to Mr. Draghi it was tough, it was difficult. He had to do very, complex negotiations, I am sure. And he already had done great service by keeping the interbank market liquid, by funding the commercial banks at a time when they were very, very vulnerable, and by having said all it takes to protect the euro. So we owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Draghi and also to the Fed and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. But again, don't expect them to do everything. They can only do so much. After that, governments have to take over.
Agree.
Aitäh, sellega on meie tänane pressiüritus lõppenud. Aitäh kõikidele asjaosalistele.